Okay, welcome to Lecture 8 of Collaborative Software Development. In this final lecture in this course, we're going to discuss who owns the code that you write and how can you use it. By the end of this lecture, we're hoping that you'll be able to choose who owns the copyright of code that you write in a given situation and why, choose an appropriate license for your software, so for example for your packages that you developed in this courses for the project, or your analysis code, for example, like you wrote in the workflows course, and how you choose an appropriate license for your non-software data science work. Full disclosure before we get going, I am not a lawyer. I am just somebody who has some experience sharing my materials as well as who has done some amount of reading on the topic. So in both Canada and the US, software code falls under the copyright law. Knowing who owns the copyright of software is really important because if the owner controls how the code might be distributed, sold, copied, modified, basically all the things that could essentially make your code project profitable. While we're talking about copyright, it's really important to note that copyright is really only protecting the language and the words used to express ideas, concepts, and themes, not the ideas, concepts, and themes themselves. So in the context of some software code, the copyright is actually protecting the code that was typed out, not necessarily or at all what the code actually does or the ideas behind it. Let's first talk about Canadian copyright laws for software code. So in Canada, software code is considered a piece of literary work and it falls under the copyright law. Under Canadian law, the copyright owner is afforded the following rights. So there are economic rights. With these rights, if you are the copyright owner, you have the right to produce the work, reproduce the software code, publish it, translate it, authorize it, and convert it. In Canada, we also have something called moral rights. These moral rights come in three different flavors, and all three of them are afforded when somebody writes software code. So the first is the right to claim authorship or the right to remain anonymous or use a pseudonym or pen name. The first is probably most likely use of it in writing software code. The second is the right to integrity, so that you would not be libeled or slandered by the use of your work. And the third is the right of association with your work, so that you are to be known going forward as the person who wrote the code, for example. The economic rights in copyright and Canadian law can be transferred to entities other than the author who typed the code on the screen. And so in a little bit, we're going to be talking, in a little bit in the future, we're going to be talking about the case where you write the code while you're employed by somebody. And in those cases, the economic rights can be transferred or are transferred to whoever the employer is, the individual or the business. Moral rights, on the other hand, under Canadian law, cannot be transferred. They can, however, be waived, and this is often common practice when you are working as an employer. Let's now talk about the difference in the US. So US copyright laws for software code, you get 4 rights if you are the copyright owner. You have the right to reproduce the code, the right to create derivative works based on the code, the right to distribute copies of the code, and the right to display the code. In the US, there is not really the equivalent of the moral rights of copyright that is in Canadian law. Okay, so now we understand what rights you are afforded depending on whether you're in Canada or the US if you are the copyright owner, but then the question comes up, who has copyright ownership? And this is a complicated question, and the answer starts with it depends. So we'll start with the simplest case where you are the author of the code, so you typed it on the screen yourself, and you are doing this for yourself. So this is not code that you typed for your, that has anything to do with your current employer. You are not in a consulting relationship with somebody who you're writing code for. This is just like your own side project, for example, or your own hobby. In this kind of case, the person who typed the code, i.e. you, automatically becomes the copyright owner. In both Canada and the US, you don't need to affix the copyright symbol, that little C in the circle, to your work to become the copyright owner. It automatically you become the owner in this situation. Some countries do, however, require this. So if you are working outside of Canada or the US, you should look into this. And I do want to note that although the copyright symbol is not required, it's often still used in copyrighted works in both Canada and the US because it clearly identifies that the code is protected by copyright. So it's just making things a little bit more transparent to whoever is using it. A second thing that I wanted to note is that another thing that's not required but is recommended and often done in practice for these kind of works is that you register your copyright. So in the lecture notes, I link you to the government sites in Canada and the US where you can register your copyright for a work. It's really not very painful to do this. It doesn't cost very much money and it can be done very quickly. And doing this can help clarify who is the code owner and how would I say, if this does come into question, it provides a little bit more evidence that who the copyright owner is. Let's talk about a different case. What about if you are now on the job? You've just left MDS, you've got hired, you're collecting a regular hourly or salaried paycheck from your employer, and within your scope of work, you are expected to write some code to do some data analysis, for example. So in this sort of situation, in both Canada and the US, if you write code for work as an employee, the copyright owner is typically assigned to the employer, not to the person who types the code out. The specifics differ a little for Canada and the US, so let's discuss each of these separately. So in the case of Canada, software code is defined as work made in the course of employment, and therefore the copyright ownership is assigned to the employer if it satisfies the following criteria. So if the author of the code was in the employment of some other entity, so a person or a business, under a contract of service or apprenticeship, and the code was written in the course of their employment by that business or person. Also, there has to be no agreement that states otherwise, that says that the employee, for example, retains the ownership of the copyright for the code written during the term of the employment. In such a case, the copyright goes to the employer. Now, in the sentence above, I bold the term of. This is an important distinction in Canada to make a difference between a contract for service. So when you're doing a contract of service, that's closer to a typical employee-employer relationship, where again, you have a job, you're collecting a regular paycheck, you have a boss that assigns you tasks, and the tasks include, for example, writing code in the scope of your work. In the contrast, in a contract for services, this is more like when you are working like an independent consultant and you're doing services for your client. In these sorts of cases in Canada, it's not automatically assumed that the copyright goes to the client. Typically in these sorts of cases, there would be some sort of written agreement that clearly states who owns the copyright at the end of this project. What about in the US? So in the US, we use a slightly different term. We call it work made for hire. And in a work made for hire situation, again, this is your typical employee-employer relationship, the copyright ownership is assigned to the employer. This happens in two different cases. One, if the writing of the code is done by an employee in the scope of their employment. And two, the writing of the code was specially ordered or commissioned for use in one of 10 predefined categories. And there also must be a written agreement signed by the developer that explicitly states that the work is made for hire. So this second case is, again, more like this independent consulting case that I mentioned in the previous slide. So in the US, this does typically fall under the work made for hire, and therefore the client typically gets the ownership for the code, but there is a written agreement that has to be signed. And if that agreement is not signed, then it's not automatically that the client would get the ownership of the code. What are some implications when you do things like this and you forgo the copyright ownership of the code that you write? Well, if you do this and then you go to work on another project at a different company or for yourself, or maybe for even a different branch of the company that you've been working in, you can't automatically reuse any of the code that you wrote for that last project where the copyright ownership went to somebody else. You would really need to negotiate a license to use that code again, the same way any other like external third party would. Are there ways, an obvious question that comes from this is like, are there things that the developer or the analyst, you, for example, can do to mitigate this? And there are possibly some things you can do. So one, for example, if you're in a consulting position and you have a client that is trying to hire you for service to write some code for you, is that you could have some sort of negotiation before you start writing the code, and that instead of the client kind of purchasing the copyright or the code straight out, that they purchase a license to the code that you write, as opposed to hiring just you to write the code and giving it to them. The second is that at the beginning of a project, you should really think about what new code you will write for this project that will be core to this project, and what code that you've written previously or other people have written previously that you would perhaps like to use again and really isn't, core to this project. There's a lot of code like this in any project. And so if you think about this at the outset of the project, you can negotiate an agreement where you can say that this pre-built code are outside of the work that will be copyrighted, and you get a written agreement with the client or the employer about this, and therefore you should be able to reuse such code again in future projects. So it really comes down to anytime you start working for somebody, you do really want to carefully read through the legal documents that you are asked to sign, so that you understand who owns the code you write and how you can use it again in the future. And if you don't like what they're offering you on paper, you should talk to them and negotiate about this, and perhaps even bring a lawyer in. I know that a lawyer does typically cost money, but you can view bringing a lawyer in at this part of contract negotiation as some sort of like insurance premium that you're going to pay to help you not regret choices in the future. Now we're going to switch gears from talking about purely copyright to licenses and how these two things are related. So why would you need a license for the code that you write? So we've previously mentioned that creative works, like software code in the US and Canada, are considered creative works and fall under copyright law. They're automatically eligible for this copyright protection. And because of that, reusing creative works like software code without a license can be dangerous, especially if it's not your code, because the copyright holder technically could sue you for copyright infringement. Thus, if you publicly share your creative work, like software code, put it on GitHub for example, you should let others know if and how they can reuse it or not. And we typically do this via using a file called license or license.txt. We put this file in the base directory of our project, and we clearly state what license we are making this creative work, this software code, available to others for use. So again, we do this so that other people feel comfortable using our work and know how they should be able to use our work and what restrictions we'd like to place upon its use. Now keep going in this train of thought. Unless you include a license that specifies how people can use your work, nobody else legally can copy it, distribute it, modify it without being at risk of takedowns, shakedowns, or legal litigation. And where this starts to get really important to you is once the work starts to have other contributors, each of them becomes a copyright holder. And then that nobody who can use the work without permission or this unclarity of how you can use the work includes you. So this is really important. So you're working on a coding project. You've written a bunch of code. Somebody that you work with or that you're partnering with or friends with wants to contribute to the project. You think that's a great idea. You haven't given a license to the work yet. They contribute some code, say through a pull request. You accept that pull request. Your code bases become merged. And then you want to go and use that code for a different project or for something else at work. If you don't have a license that says how you can do that or if you can do that, then you can't legally do that because the other person who contributed that code also has copyright ownership of that work. So it is really important when you're writing code to and working in a group to figure out these agreements up front. Okay, how do licenses work? Well, the licenses solves this copyright problem by granting rights to others that they would otherwise not have. And what rights are being granted under which conditions differs depending upon the license. And we'll take a look at a few of these in a little bit and explore what these look like. Now, one note before we move any further, licenses are legal documents and written by legal experts. Most of you, I don't know about all of you, but most of you, including myself and everyone else on the MDS core teaching team, do not have the legal expertise to write our own licenses. So we should definitely not do this. Instead, you have two options. We can choose an already written one that best fits our situation, and that is the most common practice for software code, and the one we recommend to you. Or if you can't find one that suits your situation, again, this is where you need to bring a lawyer into the situation to write a license, help you write a license that is legally correct in doing what you want it to do. So how does one choose a license? So in practice, there really are just a few licenses that are really popular in software. And there are resources like choosealicense.com, which we'll visit in a few minutes, which can help us find a common license that suits our needs. When you're doing this, important things to think about are whether you want people distributing derivative works of your code to also require others to distribute those derivative works in the same way. The second is whether or not the content you are licensing is software, is source code, and if it is, if you want to require derivatives at work to share the source code. Maybe I'll just pause here for a second and come back to this second point. We've really been focusing on copyright and licenses in the context of software code, but as a data scientist, there are other types of work that you do that might not be fully described by code. So, for example, a report that has both code and writing and figures in it. So in those sorts of cases, we might have to consider using a license another license or a different license in addition to just a software license. Okay, so some more recommendations for how to choose a license. So you want to choose one that's in common use. And the reason for this is that it makes your life easier because you've probably seen these licenses before. It also makes life easier for your project contributors and users because for the same reason, because they're more likely to have already become familiar with the license, and they don't have to wade through a whole bunch of legal jargon on a new license to decide if they're okay with using it. Okay, so at this point, I want us to take a look at choosealicense.com. to get a little bit more familiarity with the different software licenses that exist and when we might want to use some in different situations. So I'm just going to exit full screen at this point. And I've already opened chooselicense.com. So chooselicense.com is a really useful website to help you get started in this exploration of what license you might want to use on your code. They really have 6 different, I guess, landing pages off of this first page where you might want to go. So the first situation they talk about is when you are in joining a pre-existing community that you want to work in. So perhaps, for example, you've got hired by Red Hat, which is a company that makes a Linux distribution. In this case, you probably at work will be expected to use the license that is already being used by that community. And that is basically the advice that they give you on this website, and that's the advice that I would agree with as well. It's kind of similar to the advice that if somebody asks me, like, what programming language should I use for data science? I don't say R, I don't say Python. I ask them, well, who are you working with and what do they use? Because usually in these sorts of situations, when you're trying to work with a group that's already established, it's really not a good idea to go off and do your own thing separate from that group. Not at least until you really understand that group, their rationale for doing things the way they do, and have gained some credibility in that group. So in cases like that, you really should just stick with using the license that's used with that group for a while. And then if you have been working with them for a while and decide for good reason that you can well explain and articulate to other people that you think a different software license should be used, in those cases, then you should have that conversation and discuss what you might want to use and why. Okay, the next condition on this landing page is that you want to use a very simple and very permissive license. And basically, you don't really want to put any restrictions on how people are going to use your code in the future. Right here on this landing page, they suggest that you use the MIT license right up front. And give some examples of some groups here below that do use such a license. I have used such a license in the past, and I do like it, again, for its straightforwardness, simplicity, but mostly for the lack of restrictions it places on how people use it in the future. So let's go and take a look at this site, and it's going to show us a little bit more information about the MIT license. So it will show you the text for the MIT license if you want to read it. But what's really nice about this website, I'll just make the text a little bit bigger because it might seem small in the screencast, is that it gives you these very clear heads up for each of the licenses that they discuss on this site about what permissions the license gives you, what conditions the license has, and what limitations it has. So for example, MIT license, it's okay for you to use it in commercial use. It can be distributed in any way, modified in any way. It's okay for use in private use. And then it has some conditions around copyright notice. So let's go back here. And let's go to the third case for this chooselicense.com for recommending about what your general situation might be. So on the right-hand side, you care less about a simple and permissive license, but you care more about sharing the improvements. And what does this particularly mean? Well, in this case, on the right-hand side, this describes people who believe that the source code to a binary program, for example, should also be shared and distributed when you distribute and share the binary program. Okay, so one of the examples of a license that requires that is the GNU GPL 3 license. So GPL stands for General Public License, or GNU Public License. And basically, it lets people do almost anything they want with that software, except distribute what's called a closed source version. So again, what is that? That means that, for example, you write an R package and you or a Python package, and you make a binary installable version of that package, and you sell that or distribute that freely to somebody else, and you don't share the source code that was used to create the functionality in that package. So people cannot go back and look at the R code that created the functions that exist in that package, or the Python code that created the functions that exist in that package. Doing something like that would violate this GNU GPL3 license. If you use a GNU GPL3 license to create a package, it means that when you distribute that binary version of the package that is usable but not human readable, you also have to share the human readable source code alongside with it. So let's take a look at the GNU General Public License on choosealicense.com. So again, it has the license text for you, which in this case is a lot more detailed, but it does a nice job of summarizing what the permissions are, what the conditions are, and what the limitations are. So permissions, you can use this GNU GPL licenses for commercial use, for distribution, modification in patents, for private use. It does not restrict you from doing any of these things. And then here we talk about the conditions. What the conditions of such a license are basically that you need to disclose the source of the code that was used to create the binary, like the runnable version of the program. That's required by this license. And that basically, if someone then takes your source code, or you take your source code, and you derive from it or you modify from it, you are also required to use this same license again. Now, one thing I want to make a note on, there's a distinction of kind of like what is a separate project versus what is a derivative. So let's talk about the R programming language, for example. The R programming language does use a GNU General Public License, so therefore the source needs to be shared anytime the binary version of the program is shared. And if somebody was to take the R language and modify and make a derivative of it, they could, but they would also need to share the source code for that. However, all R packages, or things built on top of or in addition to R, do not need to use this GNU GPL license. So if you look at many R packages, there are lots of them that, for example, use the MIT license. And this is because you are not using our source code to write these packages, okay? So therefore, you are not required to use the same license that the programming language R was written in. And the same thing is that if you build a package that calls another function that it has a GNU GPL license, you don't have to make your package that. But if, for example, you were going to derive something from that, you copy and pasted that package's source code into your package and changed it, and it was, that was GPL license, then you would have to use the GPL license. Okay, so back to the choosealicense.com. What if none of these things work for you? Well, we'll discuss in a minute what happens when your project isn't software, or if there are some components of your project that's not software. And I'm going to take you to a different website for that. What if you want more license choices than just the MIT license or the GNU GPL license? So you can go here, and it is going to help you navigate several other common licenses that you can take a look at, and it will have those nice simplifications for you for permissions and so on. And then it has a discussion of what happens if you don't choose a license. And again, it goes back to the implications of copyright ownership and how that can limit how you and or other people can use that code. Okay, so I just also wanted to make this point that open source software, even if it has a GPL license, still can be used in industry and business. So here is an example of customer stories from our studio. So all of these organizations, many of which are profitable or are for profit, do use the R programming language and our studio in their businesses for various reasons. And so I just want you to have confidence that you, despite R having the GPL license, you are able to use software that uses that license in business. That software can be made commercial, it can be sold. The restriction with the GNU GPL license, again, really comes down to the fact that when you are distributing that software, you have to also share the source code along with the binary or like the executable version of the program. And if somebody does take that software and that source code and modify it and derive something, what they would call like a new version of it, they also have to use that GPL license. Okay, so at this point I wanted to move on to the case where we discuss what happens in data science when not all my creative work is code. Maybe I have some literate coding documents that has code in it, but it also has intellectual ideas about the research that you're doing. You've got some visualizations, you've got data, you've got presentations, you've got written tutorials, books, etc. What do we do then? These software licenses don't quite seem appropriate, but I want to share my work and know how and let other people know if or how they can use it. So there are licenses available for you to use for these sort of works, and I would point you, or I am going to point you to the Creative Commons licenses. They were created specifically for these types of work, and they're widely used now in academia and the publishing industry. So before we head to their website, I just want to give you a bit of a rundown about the Creative Commons licenses. So here are 6 examples of 6 different licenses that you can use. And basically they're mix and match of these different features that you might be interested in applying to your work. So one is attribution, so one's called BY, and so that stands for attribution. So if you choose a license that has BY, and all 6 of these do, it means that other people have the capacity to copy, distribute, and display your work. They can perform it, they can remix it, as long as they give you credit. And you can describe how you would like that credit to be given to you. ND is no derivative works, so people can copy, distribute, display, or perform verbatim copies of your work, but they're not allowed to modify it, change it, build off of it in any sort of way. Share alike has a very similar feature to those GNU GPL licenses, in that if you add this feature to your license, others can just redistribute your work, but they have to also use the same share alike license. So these types of licenses are sometimes called infective, and that as people keep deriving and building off these works, the same license carries and requirement carries on. And then the fourth thing that you can add to one of these licenses if you are interested is non-commercial. So you don't want others to be able to use your work for commercial purposes. And so perhaps some of you might not see, especially if you're very interested in business and wanting to make money, this doesn't seem like a good thing for your license. But for someone like myself who's writing perhaps textbooks or tutorials and lessons, and I want them to be widely shared by the world, and I don't want students perhaps to pay really big prices. I might attach something like this non-commercial license to some of my works that I want to keep, open and low cost for people. Okay, so when you want to choose a Creative Commons license, the Creative Commons now has this nice feature to help you choose your license. So basically, it's assumed that all licenses will be BY for attribution, and then you answer these following questions, and it helps you. Do you want to allow adaptations of your work to be shared? We could say, sure, we're okay with that. I guess as long as other people are going to share it like I do. And when I toggled here, you'll see that it changes the symbols that are used down here. And these symbols represent those classes that we just talked about. So this one here is the BY class, and this one here is the share alike. Let's say I don't want commercial uses of my work, and so you'll see the non-commercial showing up here. And so as you select these radio buttons, we'll see that the website tells us what license we're using. So this is the Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike 4.0 international license. And if we click on this link here, it will take us to the text version for this license. So it's a really nice tool, very simple to use tool that helps you choose the right license for your work when your work is not purely source code. What else did I want to talk about here? I'm just going to also point you to this link here where Creative Commons has created a nice resource of things for you to think about when you are selecting those radio buttons and the implications and what these things mean, so that you take some more time before you choose your license. Okay. I think that's all that I wanted to say about Creative Commons licenses. I have listed here for you 4 different software tools for you to go ahead and explore and look at some of the licenses for, and some of these you're using. So it's very interesting for you to take a look at, I think, what the licenses are, and think back to what we've talked about today and what implications it has on how you use these things at work. I've also put a list of resources together for you here if you want to read more information. This first one, Who Owns the Code, I think is really well written and does a really great job of going in more detail than I went today about copyright, ownership in your code, and licenses, and gives recommendations for when you're going out to the job to negotiate these things. I've linked to some Canadian resources for you as well. So one, do you actually own the code? Do you actually own the IP generated by your Canadian employees? That's an interesting read as well. And then a lot of people have questions about these GNU licenses that have this sort of infectivity and how they may or may not be used in commercial and industry. So please go to this frequently asked questions about the GNU licenses page so that you can have the confidence that in many cases in industry, you are able to use these GNU licenses. They just come with implications, like for example, sharing the source code for the programs that use these licenses. And I want to provide some attribution to some of the resources that I used to build this lecture. So some of this came from the Software Carpentry, some of this came from choosealicense.com, and some came from, I will add these earlier, some of the resources really inspired what I talked about today. So in particular, Who Owns the Code, and the do you actually own the IP generated by your Canadian employees? Okay, so that's all I have to say in this webcast about copyright and licenses. And so what I hope to do following this is have a question and answer period with you all, and so we can discuss some of these things in more detail or discuss some of the specific things that you're interested in.